Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Tortoise Responsible Business Summit. My co-founder, Katie Vanek-Smith, and I, when we were talking about what Tortoise's approach to business and business journalism should be, she said really simply, well, business is everyone's business, that more than ever, what happened impacts all of us. They have the power to address the big questions that link both prosperity and society. And she puts it really neatly that the thing that we're interested in is putting people and planet on a par with profit. And that sounds neat, it's an alliteration, but of course it's an incredibly difficult and demanding thing to do. And we're delighted that through the course of the day, you're joining us, a cast of people who, in a host of different ways, face those choices every day, are joining us. Tortoise, as you know, is committed to the idea of open journalism. We want what we do to be informed by everyone. We used to say that everyone has a seat at the table. In fact, the technological acceleration of 2020 means that we've done one better than that. All of us are in the screen. All of us have the same size square, the same chance to weigh in. Please do that through the course of every single session today. You'll see that you can either just put your hand up, you'll know the drill by now, you hit the participants tab and you can raise your little blue digital hand, or just as well, say what you think in the chat. My colleague, fellow editor and partner at Tortoise, Liz Mosley, is running the chat for this first session, and she will prompt and prod me to weave in your point to the conversation that I'm having with Dave Lewis. And welcome, Dave. It's great to see you this morning. By the way, as Dave and I were just preparing for this, I was sort of chortling, and he was chortling back a little hollowly, that he's, I think, not quite 2 weeks out of his job at Tesco, and anyone else would have thought this would be a good chance for a lie-in. David, it's very good of you that you've managed to get out of your pajamas and join us for this, the first session. I wanted to get straight into it. People will know you, obviously, having spent the better part of the last 7 years running Tesco, a company that probably touches every single person in the UK in a different way. But I know you're also the chair of the WWF in the UK, that you've headed the task force on food waste globally, and that you're working on the Leverhulme Trust. I think the thing that we're going to really focus on today is food waste, partly because it's one of those examples of a massive business subject that both companies and individuals can actually fix, right? And we're really interested in that kind of problems and solutions journalism too. I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish though. So Dave, I thought it might be useful just to start, say, I know that your last day, I think, at Tesco was on the 30th of September. And when you look at the data that must come pouring into a company like that, you must have a feel for the kind of economy we're in and what we face in 2021. So will you just start with an outlook for what you think business and economy and individuals in society in the UK face in the coming year?
Okay, thank you, James. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me on. James, to your question, I think obviously we find ourselves in a very difficult time. If I borrow from the Tesco experience, when the pandemic started, we set up a very extensive panel that allowed us to track sentiment. And you wouldn't be at all surprised that number one issue for everybody is safety, for obvious reasons. But number two was the economy. And it was continuing to rise, and there were reasons for that given the concerns about unemployment. And I think, given that we're talking about food, if you want a sense about the economy, the thing that always used to drive us at Tesco was that actually, even today, with the average income being around £29,000 a year, there are still a little bit more than 8 million people who struggle to provide all the food that they and their families need during any given week. So that tension that's there, and I think the other fact that always used to motivate us is the idea that the poorest 10% of our population spend nearly 80% of their disposable income on food. So there's a real challenge, because obviously the prospect of more unemployment will put yet more pressure on that. So I have to say the outlook for the economy at the end of this year and going into 2021 is not positive from a retail point of view. And you see the whole industry think about how it is it can prepare to help customers through what is going to be a very challenging period.
And Dave, I'm always aware that people, in positions like yours, I know you're not speaking for Tesco, you've moved on, but I know that people are very cautious about talking down the economy, denting confidence. It's such an important part of contributing to the economy itself. But there's also a wariness, I feel, about saying, look, this is how it's going to be. When you say that the outlook is not positive, what does that mean?
Well, I think, the sentiment trackers that you would see from a number of places show the concerns that people have. You can see it in the way that people start to adjust their spending habits. I think the problem for anybody who sits as a CEO of a business commenting on the economy is that people will read across from their comments directly to the business that they run. And I suppose one of the reasons I think I can, as an ex-food CEO, talk a little bit more about that, and this is why we used to share with the government some of that information in order to inform their policy decisions, is that actually food is quite a resilient part of the economy. So it's very good at understanding what customers are thinking and what it is they're changing, but you don't necessarily have the same impact back into your business that some other sectors might. So I think that's why you probably get people being wary of making comments. But I think now, objectively, we can see, as furlough comes to an end, as the government tries to do the best that it can to support people, there will be less money in the economy, and that's definitely going to have an impact. And unemployment is the thing which has by far and away the single biggest impact. So watching what might happen with unemployment is obviously key.
Did you have, Dave, in the media business, we watch advertising. It's always a leading indicator. As you see the ads drop off, where things are going. In the food business, are there certain things, as in purchase patterns in the last week of the month, or certain goods that spike early in the month and then disappear later? Are there things that you look for in particular that were like, these are canaries in the coal mine?
Well, there are patterns anyway, James. In good times, there are patterns where end of the week, end of the month, sort of paydays and things. So those patterns have always been there. I think actually the leading indicators for food actually come outside of food. So if you look back over the last 6 recessions, which I did when I started at Tesco, you wouldn't be surprised. The first thing that happens is big capital items, cars get delayed. People don't spend money on things like that normally. Then it was holidays, then it was eating out, and then it was changing how it is they consume food they bought in the supermarket. That's changed somewhat now because obviously hospitality industry, travel, things have changed. So we'll see it slightly differently here. But if you do get into a recession, what you normally see in food, and it hasn't happened yet. So just to be really clear, this hasn't happened yet. And one of the things you watch for is people down trade in the tiers of food they buy. So in a Tesco sense, people will move from finest to core, or core to exclusively at Tesco. So that's the things that you tend to see. But in fairness, up until 10 days ago, we weren't seeing that in UK food market.
Well, Dave, that's really interesting. There's so many things we could talk about. I think that the thing that we wanted to talk about, though, and it felt like the right call just to say, let's see if we can focus on one particular subject, is this question about food and, if you like, the food economy, and specifically the question of food waste. As you know, I come to this with a journalist skill set, i.e. very little information, a great deal of interest, but no firm knowledge. So why don't we start with just a description? I mean, genuinely, can you explain to us what the problem is? I think most of us treat food waste as a sort of subject of guilt. We know we do it, we just don't know what to do about it.
Okay, all right, James. Well, look, why don't we start quite broad and then come into food waste specifically and what we can do about it, because there are a lot of things we can do about it. So look, depending which measure you take and where you draw the lines, let's start from the global food production industry. Emits something around 30% of all greenhouse gases produced on the planet. So as an industry, if you like, right, a massive footprint. If you look at WWF's Living Planet report, published about 10 days ago, they've identified that actually the single biggest cause of biodiversity loss, laddering up to climate change, is the food production system. So it's a massive issue because we're taking more and more of the natural habitat to produce more food for a growing population. So at a macro level, that's the problem that we really need to think about. Now, the bit about food waste, and I think you've got a slide here that might help everybody, is that actually already today, 1/3 of all the food that is produced today is either lost or wasted. Right, so before we even produce any more, we lose 1/3 of it. And that's at a time when 1 in 9 people around the world go hungry. And actually, if you look at that economically, and this is 2018 number, just short of $1 trillion of economic loss related to that food lost or wasted. And whilst I was talking about the total food system being around 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, 8%, if you put food waste together, food loss and waste together, 8% of total greenhouse gas emissions come from food waste. That would make, if you look at the bottom right-hand part of this chart, if food waste were a country, it would be 3rd after China and the USA in terms of greenhouse gas emissions.
And Dave,
sorry, mate.
1 second. When you talk about food waste, is that what I throw in the bin? Is that what Tesco throws in the bin? Or is that stuff that happens on a farm that doesn't necessarily get to the shops?
Okay, perfect question, James. So if you look at the slide on the top right, so the whole sustainable development goal is about food loss and waste. And what you see, this is all information put together by the WRI for the Champions Group. We'll come on to that. Where food is lost or wasted depends very much on the development of the supply chain. So you can see the different regions around the world. And you see, if you allow me to short form, in the so-called developed part of the world, the vast majority of food is lost post-harvest, but pre it being at a store or to a customer. So it's lost in storage or it's lost in transit. When you get to the developed world, so-called developed world, significantly more of it is wasted after it's bought. So James, if we bring it to the UK, so in the UK, post-harvest, so after it's been harvested on farm, 71% of food is wasted post-harvest in the UK. About 3%, RAP would say, is in the retail supply chain, and 67% of all food that's wasted is after people have bought it. So exactly what it is you're throwing away at home. Does that help?
Yeah, that is all right. Well then, yeah, I mean, it's amazing, that graph in the top right corner in the difference in the world. I mean, if I understand it correctly, we're actually then, we're a green bar in the UK, Dave, that's actually worse than the United States. It's worse than that 61%.
Yeah, it's true. And so
why is that? Do we just buy too much, or we don't know how to take care of our food? Why is that, as individuals, that we're wasting so much food?
It's really interesting, James, because this data here is the baseline that was used in 2018.
Right.
I'm pleased to say, we'll come on and talk about it. It's changed quite a bit in the last 2 years. It's changed a lot, interestingly, very interestingly, during the pandemic. But what was happening? So in the lead up to this, there was a whole series of things that were happening. One was sort of promotional activity in retail. So I think in 2015, if I speak just for Tesco, we stopped all multi-buy promotions in fresh produce, because what was happening is people were buying more than they needed to get better prices and then not eating it when it was back in the home. Right. So we stopped things like that. The industry put things like portion packs in to try and help things such as that. But the other thing that was happening was a lifestyle change. So as you know, in the UK, the largest number of households are either single or 2 people households. They were shopping less frequently and shopping on the way home from work. And what was happening is people were wasting a lot of food because they were changing what it is they did. If they bought food for 3 nights, but then didn't stay at home, went out, which was happening a lot, then that was driving. So there was a very big behavioral change that was driving up some of that food waste.
So then there begin to be lots of really interesting observations, and obviously one of the things here is that these are huge sweeping numbers. I've seen that, you know, Ramsay Sargent has made differentiation within markets, and I suppose within countries and cities and economic groups. But do you want to come, Dave, just then to talk through? There's a funny feeling I've got this morning, which is I thought when we got started, oh, great, we'll have Dave Lewis, we'll talk about food waste. It's a good story about how we're making progress on this. Suddenly, I'm absolutely hitting the solar plexus thinking, good grief, look at the scale of that problem. Is there progress being made? Is it a fixable problem?
Yes, it is. Look, so as you know, you mentioned it in the start. So there's a Sustainable Development Goal 12.3 that says, actually, how do we halve food loss and waste by 50% by 2030? A coalition of the willing came together. The Dutch government put some money into the WRI, set up a secretariat, and for the last 5 years, I've chaired that group. And that's a group which represents governments around the world and businesses around the world who are trying to do this. They set up a process which is about target, measure, act. The target's clear. A way of measuring, because it's really important that we find a way of measuring that's consistent across, because then that allows us to share things that act. Now, every year there's an update. And if I simplify it, James, we look at it this way, which is 2 bits of progress, one with governments and one with business. So there's some really interesting work. If I take the government stuff on some of the private, public-private partnerships, so the Indonesian rice industry is one of them. The African Trade Congress is another. And the one that I'm particularly excited about, which we've been banging on at for 4 or 5 years now, is China are finally, I don't know if you've seen this, come up with a clean plate initiative. Mm-hmm. So China, 1.4 billion people. It's estimated that food waste in China would feed about 50 million people a year. There's a cultural challenge that the Premier is taking on, which is particularly in food service, and we should talk about that. Quite a lot of food is wasted in hospitality and food service, something like 36% in China, because the habit and the tradition of buying big banquets as a way of entertaining. So there's progress. Governments, by and large, are a bit slower than some of the businesses. And if I give you the business end of this, probably the biggest initiative is something called 10 by 20 by 30. So based on some of the work that we did here in Tesco, and we can talk about that if you're interested, the 10 biggest retailers in the world have recruited their 20 largest food suppliers to come with them on the journey of halving food loss and waste by 2030. Mm-hmm. And that's based on this Tesco model that we've been running for the last 5 years, where 27 of Tesco's largest fresh produce suppliers have been measuring and publishing their food loss data. Last couple of weeks ago announced that saved about 200,000 tons of food by working together in that way. So the idea is to take what the UK has done and take that to the 10 largest retailers in the world. And I think it's actually up to the 14 largest retailers in the world, recruit their suppliers and have a big impact. So that's already starting to have really quite a significant impact. So there is a lot that we can do.
And Dave, I'm struck by Neil Stavos's question. You may not have been able to read it as you were talking, who asks, how can companies like Tesco drive effective change in consumer habits? And he puts it rather neatly, we can't just describe the water when we're drowning. So will you talk about that, how you actually change the way we behave?
It's really interesting. So last week, just to bring it right up to date, I was reading, so something we've been working on in the summer. So Tesco done some work with a business called Hubbub. Small scale, it's small scale. But what it is recruiting people to work together on food waste in the home. So behavior change, community, right sort of language, right sort of rewards. And they published last week the results of that trial through the summer. And there was a 76% reduction in waste, mm-hmm. right? And 95% of the families that were involved noticed a massive change in their consumption behavior. And I think, if I'm right, the average saving for that family was about £16 a week. So there are things that can be done. The critical thing now is to be able to scale that. So I think you'll see changes in operations, the sort of promotional, the portion pack sizes, all of those things happening. But what now needs to happen, and this is where the Consumer Goods Forum is also important, you might ask Alan when you see him later, is the idea that we can use our skill and our knowledge about communication to take some of those lessons from that hubbub trial and make them applicable to the UK more broadly. One thing I should say, because James, you said, I didn't want to depress you this morning. Actually, the UK does lead in the world. Mm-hmm. So whilst there is loads more that we can do and we should do, the UK, so the RAP report shows that the UK is reduced by 2020 versus the baseline of 15, the UK is reduced by 27% food loss and waste. So actually, it's the only country which is ahead of the target of getting to 50% by 2030. So actually, we should be positive about what has happened, but not at all complacent, because there's so much more that we can and we should do.
Dave, I want to start bringing in some of the people who are sort of raising points and asking questions. What a lot of them around the relationship between the big food retailers and us as consumers. What behaviour is incentivized by the retailers and what sits with us? As there was a really interesting comment made where one person simply said that green in your bar charts is gluttony and the yellow is inefficiency. And so I have to say a certain amount of it, I appreciate sits with us, but it's that relationship between our culture of eating food and buying food and the industry that's really interesting. I'm gonna bring in first, if I might, assuming she join us, Lisa Hogg asked a sort of a good question about the way in which food labeling, sell by dates, that whole question. And so, Lisa, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hey.
Do you want to?
Hi, Lisa.
More better today than I will.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've personally experienced and really caught myself well, I noticed I live in the Netherlands. I've been living in Amsterdam for 22 years. And one thing I noticed living here is the milk sell by date. So the milk sell by date in South Africa, where I was born and raised, when it says the milk's going to go off, as we would say, that date, you can't drink that milk. In the Netherlands, you can definitely drink that milk a few days after. And then I've watched myself with fresh produce, for example, whether it's, I've stopped buying pre-packed lettuce, but when I did, if the date's there, you kind of have this default of just start chucking it in a bin. And it just made me realize we're not sort of tasting, smelling, being sort of sensible that way. And my gut feel is that actually leads to a lot of the food waste. In you try and shop carefully, but if the sell-by date is gone, and if you haven't really paid attention to buying the pack at the back of the line rather than at the front of the line. So yeah, I mean, it's just something that I've thought that's interesting from I think a human behavior. Mm-hmm. We overtly trust that printed date.
Right.
Yeah. Lisa, the point is extremely well made, and if you're in a country like the UK, you can end up with 2 dates sometimes on certain foodstuffs, which are about display until and best before. So there's been a big initiative with the Consumer Goods Forum, and quite controversially, about 18 months ago, we took, and I'm now speaking about Tesco because obviously I have that experience. We took an awful lot of best before dates off certain products because actually what customers told us is they're very able to tell whether a food is still safe to be eaten. Certainly in terms of fresh food, it's a visual inspection, other things. There are a couple still of rules, some European, some local around timing and dating of food, but there's an opportunity to simplify that a lot. And your comment allows me to say that, just to illustrate your point, so I'm supporting your point here, is as a retailer, once there is a display until date on something, you can't legally sell it thereafter, right? So it's not up for debate. Once that date is gone, you have to take it off. Now, we reckon in Tesco about 65% of that food is still, it changes by mix, still safe for human consumption. So that's why we set up this food redirection system. So of the food that is so-called wasted, but still safe to be eaten. Tesco donates that food through Fair Share and has done for the last 5 years to community projects. So I say that only because it supports your point that actually best before dates are not always that helpful in this debate.
Dave, thanks. And Lisa, thanks so much. Dave, someone called Nick Yields has made a point about massive step changes in food waste. Nick, can you explain what you're working on and talk us through it?
Yeah, sure. So, well, for the last several months, basically, I've been trying to build a business that specifically tries to tackle greenhouse gas emissions. And food waste was the area that we decided really needed solving. And what we found was that people, particularly in places like London, where you live in blocks of flats a lot of the time, actually being able to recycle your food waste was a massive issue because councils just couldn't provide it. And so we've been looking into trying to solve that, and have basically come to the conclusion that one of the massive issues here is that we just have no idea as consumers how much waste we actually get rid of. And we are used to dealing with things like, smart meters for our electricity and gas and seeing our water bills and everything, but we can't see that for the amount of waste that we have at all. And one of the sort of the shining examples in the world of how to do this well is South Korea. They went from, I can't remember what it was, a very, very low percentage of food waste being recycled to over 95% because they introduced these smart bins, which meant that you had to effectively tap in with an RFID tag to identify you when you dispose of waste, and then that can track it back to you. And I really think we need to do something like that in the UK as well.
Nick, I would agree. I think, look, we could talk about what a proper national recycling infrastructure could be for food and indeed some other things. There's a massive opportunity and big gap there. There's, Nick, your question, there's some really interesting work on smart meters that are in the food service industry, because if you look at the business case shows that actually it's a very economically sensible thing to invest in food waste reduction. We talked about supermarkets and homes, but we've got to remember that 50% of the food that's eaten in the UK, in fact slightly more, is eaten out of home. And the food wasted through hospitality and food service is significantly higher than the 3% that we do through the retail footprint. So it's actually something more holistically we need to look at. And so the idea of bringing some of those smart bins, which are being trialed in food service in the UK, into domestic use is something that we looked at in Tesco. It's just not there yet in terms of technology readily available at scale to the UK. But it's a really good point.
Sorry, Nick, yeah.
Could I just add something to that quickly, though? That when we were researching this, because we came into this completely unbiased and just thought, okay, which are the biggest areas to tackle? And what we found was that in the UK specifically, 70% of food waste comes from households, not from restaurants and so on. And in the commercial sector, there is already really good solutions. Like you have companies like First Mile, because the restaurants, for example, are legally obliged to recycle their food waste. Whereas when it comes to households, there is no solution, because your solution is basically the council or no one. And that's why we think that really needs to be tackled first.
Nick, thank you. Dave, if I might, I just want to, there are a few people who've made points, and I'm going to just take them at a rush. I'm going to invite Susan Hill and Tony Goldner and Francesca Harris, if I can. Tony, I invited you a little earlier on. What was the point you were making? Can we hear you, Tony? Yeah, there you go.
Oh, sorry, James. Yes. Yeah, I was interested in the point around the use of behavioural sort of nudges to help influence this, and you spoke about that example before. For the last 20 years, I've worked at the intersection of business and government, trying to help move some of these public policy initiatives forward. And the first port of call is always kind of voluntary standards, and then sort of opt-in partnerships between industry players. And of course, the last port of call is typically regulation. And it seems whether on this issue or on climate change, all of the other big issues of the day, every week there's a new report coming out. There's dozens of new initiatives being launched by all sorts of players around the world. So I'd be interested in your insights on how do we take the successful initiatives to scale faster, because there seem to be a lot of great ideas, a lot of good initiatives, but many of them remain actually quite small and subscale despite the blizzard of reports and initiatives that are announced. So what are your thoughts from a sort of senior executive perspective about how we drive change in the right direction faster? Thanks.
Dave, I'm just going to do two at a time, if I might.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I'm just going to invite Francesca Harris too. I'm afraid Susan Hill's dropped off. So Francesca Harris, do you want to make the point you had in mind, Dave?
Hi there. So I made a couple of points. My first point actually was I used to volunteer for Fair Share, which is the organisation you mentioned, David, that Tesco supplies food for. And one thing that we used to find was we'd get massive crates of products that would come from companies that were just labelled incorrectly. And you just get these huge, huge crates that would come in, and often they were unhealthy processed food. And I know something that food banks and companies like Fair Share in the UK have issues with is when they want to then redistribute them to the populations in need, they're often unhealthy products. So it's not necessarily targeting issues of unhealthy food. It's actually just giving people excess calories, which they might not necessarily want. They might actually be wanting the healthier food. So it's not just the type of, we sort of almost need to think about the type of food. And then a second point I raised was that when one thing we have as a problem is when the food is wasted, it gets put into landfill unless it's obviously composted. And if it's not composted in landfill, it can increase emissions of methane because it reacts with the products there. So it's not just the point of, okay, we've wasted those foods and we've lost those greenhouse gas emissions in their production. It's actually also that food increases greenhouse gas release after it's even wasted. Those are my points. Thank you.
Okay. Very good. James, do you want me to answer the two and then carry on?
Yeah, two, yes, far away, yes, please.
Yeah. So look, Nick, I completely agree with you in terms of the nudges. I don't know if you look, about 4 weeks ago, maybe a little longer, I wrote an opinion piece for the Financial Times that argued for the need for a holistic food strategy for the country, and that I encouraged that actually I don't think this is something that will happen if you leave it to the market. I actually do believe that there's good practice that could be scaled, but actually it needs to be done within a policy framework, and that probably would include the need for some legislation as well. I think it will be very hard for individual businesses to step away from some of the things that are happening because they'll feel that they'll lose some competitive advantages, and a much more structural approach to this is possible. It's not difficult. It requires a bit of political will, but I personally would be in favor of a much more holistic food strategy that takes on some of these learnings. We know as Tesco, to your behavioral point, any times that Tesco points the finger and says you must or you should or you have to, people reject that. That's why I said the hubbub thing was really interesting. The tone of voice that's needed from that nudge point of view is actually really very important. But if we want to make a change at scale, we need a national food strategy, and part of that needs to address the prospect of waste. To the point on redistribution and fair share, so both of those are absolutely right. So one of the big challenges, we work with Fair Share, we have done for a while. We used to donate our food that's still safe to be eaten to 7,000 charities in the pandemic. That's gone up to 9,000 charities, and I think it's about 100 million meals. As was suggested, the biggest issue for those community projects is that actually they don't know what food is going to be available at any one point in time, and it may have some of the health profile of that which was described is extremely variable. So when we worked with Fair Share, they said to us, look, we said, what more could we do? We set about training their community food chefs. So, and actually in this sense, we recruited Jamie Oliver to help us in that sense. So we trained 1,000 chefs to be able to take the food that was donated and be able to turn that into nutritional food that was right for those community projects. The second part of what you said is, look, there's not so much. So if I take Tesco again as an example, because it's close to me, no food to landfill, no waste to landfill since 2009. Any food that is not safe to be eaten or is damaged and therefore can't be redistributed either goes to animal feed, depending on what it is, or is sent for energy recovery. So there are still some people landfilling. So your point is absolutely right. but it is actually decreasing. In the case of Tesco, it hasn't been for more than a decade any food to landfill.
Dave, thank you, and thank you, Tony and Francesca too. I'm just going to invite in finally someone who calls themselves the Oblique Life host. I don't know whether they're hosting our Oblique Lives or their own Oblique Life, but what?
Okay.
But is the Oblique Life host there?
Yes. Hey, so sorry. I completely. I keep forgetting to change my name on the different calls that I'm on and not. So my apologies for that.
What is your name?
It's actually Robbie Samaria, but my company's called the Oblique Life. But yeah, thank you for getting me on. And I love the Together bands, by the way. I like the representation. I saw those. Good goals as well. No, I just wanted to share that there's a fantastic company called Mimica, which we've been working with and looking at, and they actually are solving that label problem.
Mm-hmm.
And what they actually have done is they've found this incredible solution where they mimic the bacteria that causes the food to go off. So what the label does is a smarter label, and it actually lets you know when it's really off. So when the label turns, and they're just piloting, I think, with they're going to start with milk as their first product. And then they're going to go try and move to other foodstuffs. But it's really a fantastic innovation, and they're doing some good work on that side.
Thank you, Dave. In answering that, like the companies that are innovating to help make changes, will you also? I notice how time's run on, and so will you wind up by answering that question, and one for all of us on the call, which is what you would most like us to do to help us address this problem?
Okay, so look, I don't know about Mimica, but I will go away and find out. There is an awful lot of interesting tech out there. So if anybody's familiar, that's why Tesco launched this innovation thing called the Red Door in order to bring that innovation in. So there is a lot. But James, to your question, look, it's interesting, isn't it? During the pandemic, food waste in the UK, in home, went down by nearly 30%. Right? So RAP study, 30% reduction just during pandemic. Why? People are planning their shopping trips more. They're planning their meals more. They're scratch cooking more, particularly as families. And therefore they're being much more mindful about what it is they do. I think the more that we can actually get, and I know this sounds trite, but it's important, is there's a lot that we need to do on the supply side still, especially globally. There's a lot that we need to do on the supply side. But in a country like the UK, we also need to work on the demand side of this. And therefore, the more aware we are, the more prepared we're thinking and respecting the food that we buy and that we consume, the better we would be. And look, honestly, I think there's our own individual behavior, but there's also a preparedness for us to call on those people who look after policy to invoke and think about food. Two final things from me. The whole industrial strategy that was written 3 years ago mentioned the food industry not once. Right? It's absolutely shameful that that's the case. And it's also interesting that in our climate commitments as a government, we haven't put food waste as one of the potential contributors. So I think there's a policy part, but there's a personal behavior part as well, because we can all make a difference.
Dave, thank you. That 30% figure, you said it's a RAP figure.
Yeah.
Just explain, sorry, where's that from?
So if you looked at the amount of that was wasted in the ongoing study, and then if you look during pandemic, so since I think it was the second week of March, I think the study started, or around that time, that actually in that period, post-pandemic, I think it was 27% reduction in the amount of food that was wasted in the home compared to pre-pandemic. And that's because people were, as I say, planning their meals, eating together, and planning their shopping. So people were shopping just once, so they went back to making a list and planning food for the week rather than buying as they go. And
well, let's. The reason I would just press you on it was because I suppose those numbers, when you hear stats like that, actually what's amazing about it is the realization of quite the scale of power that you have in your hands, that you really can change.
Indeed.
Things. And, I noticed that Paul Crew made a point in the chat while you were just talking about how, if you go to those areas, the sort of reduced yellow ticket section, that could be actually, you know, really seen as he puts it, a sort of superhero type area, you know, that you're really helping. It's those kinds of things, changes in mindset, that really count, and changes in behavior that you see really count. I just want to say a massive thank you to you. As I sort of hinted at the start, you really didn't need to get up early in the morning and come and join us, but actually to do it in this case, to take a specific problem, really talk it through in the granular way that you have, and to give us a sense of what's achievable, that we can actually address it and go a long way to fixing it, really is a great way to start a day of thinking about responsible business. So Dave, a big thank you to you. Thank you to everyone for joining. I'm sorry I couldn't get everyone in, but you can imagine there's a great deal to discuss on this. I'm just going to post to your piece in the FT about food strategy, which is a whole other area of discussion, which I think is worth looking at if people get the chance. In about 5 minutes, sort of 4.5 minutes, in fact, we are talking to your former colleague, now Chief Executive of Unilever, Alan Jope. So go and make a cup of tea, have a glass of water, stretch your legs, and we'll see you all back in 4 minutes' time. But for now, we can't applaud you, but we can wave you off with a smile. Thank you very much, David.
James, thank you very much indeed. Have a good day.
You too.